I'm really grateful to everybody for being here in our bi-weekly Be Better Club. And today we're going to talk just really informally about sort of COVID-related ethics, COVID and social justice specifically. And so the way I wanted to do this is, again, incredibly informally, but I just wanted to start by thinking about the way we normally approach health-related ethics. And that's through the bioethics framework here in the US. So I think everybody in this crowd already knows bioethics in that because you've either studied it on your own or you've heard me rant about it for some time. But the bioethics approach is a principlist approach, sort of four basic guiding bioethical principles that came out of the Belmont Report, which was a result of World War II, and there's a long history there we could talk through. Hey, Renee, good to have you join us. But the four principles here are, yeah, of course, I'm glad that worked. The four principles we're after are respect for autonomy, which has taken a priority in medical ethics. So again, that has trickled down to regulatory and compliance guidelines around informed consent and patient-physician practices and things. That's been paramount, especially as a result of the radical, inhuman things we did to each other during World War II. And then we've got beneficence and non-maleficence, which are a paired set of principles. So again, beneficence came directly out of the Belmont Report, and that was doing good. And it was split up by philosophers later on who bickered correctly that there's a difference between doing good, which is an active principle, and avoiding harms, which is an inactive, a negative principle, both of which are fundamentally important. In fact, one of the arguments is non-maleficence is actually the stricter obligation. We have an obligation not to do harm. Our obligation to do good is actually, depending on the context, maybe supererogatory. Like it's not required of us, but it's an especially good thing to do. And encoded in this principles is the idea that especially physicians in relationship to patients are supposed to uphold these four principles. And there's a complex theory about the way that they're specified and balanced depending on context and case. But basically those four principles are supposed to guide us. So the little argument I wanted to offer here preemptively is that I don't think those principles work in the era of COVID. More specifically, or more generally, they're not the same as public health principles. And so that's really what I want to talk with you about today. I want to get your sense of differences you might see between the way we approach medical ethics or bioethics, right? Sort of the one-on-one relationships. And then the ways the values we hold there might butt up against practices around public health. And there's all kinds of fun examples we can draw in here. I'd like to turn to you to help me do that. I didn't put together any presentation. Again, I'd like this to be really informal. But I think all you have to do is turn on the news to hear any number of cases that might be relevant. So any initial thoughts before I continue to rant a little bit about this bioethics, public health ethics relationship?
Can you restate the thesis, Jonathan, and where you thought COVID is not an example of? I couldn't repeat it, so I want you to say it again.
Yeah, well, and it's not particularly clear to me, hence it didn't come out very clearly. But the preliminary thesis is bioethics principles don't help us understand what's going on in COVID public health ethics contexts. So we can't determine rightness or wrongness based on those four principles. That's my hypothesis, perhaps, that we can test through argument and through case analysis.
Thanks.
Awesome, Renee. Yeah, feel free, Renee. You can contribute by text or by voice, whatever's convenient for you. And the same goes for everybody. I'll follow the chat here too. So if you'd rather just type in responses, I'll integrate those in our discussion. So let me give you a for instance. Okay. So there's an ongoing controversy in the COVID era, especially here in Florida, about whether and under what conditions we should wear masks. So we could talk about this at length, as a matter of fact. The CDC guidance when the pandemic initially started, was we should wear masks when we're close to people and that's got to be coupled with social distancing. And those guidelines have seemed to strengthen and weaken depending on context and political moment and whatever. And at least one reason for that is that people have pushed back and said, no, you can't tell me to wear a mask, right? That's my choice. You want to both argue, for instance, you want to both argue that I have a right to my body, and yet you also want to tell me I have to wear a mask? Like, that's a value conflict, and I choose liberty, right? You will not tell me what I'm going to do with my own body. I will not wear a mask. Goes the preliminary argument for those of you watching online, not my argument. Does that make sense? Am I overstating the case? No, I'm not overstating the case. Lovely.
Sounds right to me.
Yeah. Okay. So what do we do about that, right? So now we've got a sort of a nationally recognized medical expert in Dr. Fauci, Anthony Fauci, who's now arguing like we're coming up on the holidays and people should not be going trick or treating and they should not be spending time with their kids or families over Thanksgiving. Like, it's not enough just to wear masks and social distance, because people hadn't social distanced and worn masks enough, right, to do what public health is supposed to do. And so the liberty side, the liberty folks might argue, look at this, put a label on him, right? This guy who's trying to oppress not only my liberties, but everybody's liberties, and say, I'm going to mandate from a government position, quote unquote, what you should and should not do, what you ought to and what you ought not to. That's an affront to my liberty, and I will not do it no matter what you say, specifically because it's an affront to my liberty. And what I'm setting up here is what I hope is not very well framed, but in my head, a pretty obvious value conflict between liberty and this other thing going on, which is public health. Now, if I recash what I've called liberty in the context of bioethics, we're talking about respect for time, the right to free decision making, free informed decision making, and that I think is a really important linchpin. But let's start with free decision making.
I have an aspect here I wanted to introduce, Jonathan. When I worked on HIV/AIDS health hotline for many years, and I was a supervisor, and we did a lot of this type of discussion and training. And as well as in planning, there's a lot of public health aspects to this. So in planning in general, when you talk about doing something, we have to do all these tests and equivalencies and try to figure out balance. Um, and a lot of times in theory, we talk about the tragedy of the commons and the concept of this common space. And when I think of that, I always go back to that kind of common space when I think about public space and the public sphere and how it's a shared space, and how if we don't come about it in the same way, that space is eroded or decayed or somehow infested with virus. So I think that somewhere in there, there's some good case studies maybe that would kind of touch upon public health and that kind of concept of shared space and social responsibility. So I think that's a lot of where public health comes from. This idea of shared responsibility, and I think we don't obviously have. First off, a lot of the things I think about is that when there's a significant amount of training that goes into communicating public health from the CDC, and the way it is that it's been allowed that the CDC people would be allowed to take the front step to not make it a political issue, to try to make it a serious middle ground issue that is neutral. So everything being a little different this time around, things were more in the political sphere, not given to the people who normally know how to communicate this without trying to incite basic differences. I think that's where a lot of the missteps happen. But and we're not being allowed as a state, especially under the Republican structure that to really kind of set our own guidelines for our own state, and then we come down to our local government, which is maybe our here in Orange County, more taking a different look and being able to do things. So we have those different spheres, as well as miscommunication. Um, so I don't know. I those are all the things I think of when you bring this up, because it's about miscommunication of what public health values are at a state level, what's important, and in guidance, because it does become more of this militaristic kind of mindset. And I believe it is best discussed that way, but also you have to have somebody from the top down distributing information that's not being debated.
Yeah, yeah. So thanks, Marissa. Yeah, that's really interesting. And the sort of HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s is a really great counterexample. And in fact, this has been brought up by leading bioethicists and by Dr. Fauci as in a recent news interview. He said that he couldn't remember, even including the HIV/AIDS epidemic um, and the growth of public health around that issue, stronger public pushback than is happening right now in the pandemic. So maybe I can bracket for a minute my sidebar on the public health details, public health ethics, and focus for a minute on the conditions that put these values in stark relief, right? So if we take it to be the case that right now there's a stronger value conflict than has ever been perceived in public health ethics before, like why is that? And what's that say about the way we make ethical decisions? Sterling, it's good to have you. Glad that you're here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
A little difficulty.
No worries at all. We're talking COVID and social justice today, thinking about the ways that bioethics and public health ethics intersect. And Marissa, I think you caught Marissa's comment, but Marissa brought back to the context of her work in the HIV/AIDS epidemic around public health several decades ago now, and how that's a parallel but different kind of problem that we're facing right now.
Jonathan, I wonder what other distinctions there are between the current COVID situation and other public health events that we might delineate that may explain why in some ways this is different or the pushback is stronger. We could say it's just the political times. And I wonder if there's other things, with smoking, for example, you could still smoke. There was just a place to go smoke. And people could probably internalize immediately negative impacts of smoking. You know, you walk into a smoky room and you start coughing, you get it. But when you talk about COVID, you don't internalize or understand maybe the risks until you yourself contract it. So the time lag is a significant issue. The sense of immediacy and the ability to use the prefrontal cortex, process information and abstractly project and into the future and understand empathetically a harm is a little more complicated with COVID, perhaps. Another thing is that the prescribed public health policy requires some level of personal sacrifice from everyone, which honestly is fairly uncomfortable. Wearing seatbelts is, kind of a public health issue that we went through, and people opposed it, but it went away over time. They're not that uncomfortable. It is quite uncomfortable to wear a mask. And the pushback there has been in part, well, if I'm doing this for people who are at risk, why don't the people at risk just stay home? Why does it have to compromise my freedoms because they have a situation? I personally don't agree with that, but I'm just asking the question, I guess, is the COVID situation in any way more nuanced that we need to identify before we try to, equate it with other public health circumstances that we face?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Kudler. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, this is part of my interest in talking about this with the group. I don't have any answers, but it seems like in my head I was thinking about everything from seatbelts is a great example. We've talked about that in one of these sessions previously, but seatbelts, smoking, we could talk about air pollution in the 80s and 90s. We could talk about climate change as another thing that's got some longitudinal time aspects to it. immediacy aspects. And then the one thing that you didn't mention that stuck on my mind is epistemic uncertainty. So there's not a lot of epistemic uncertainty around climate. So a key difference maybe between the COVID epidemic now and say ethics issues around climate change is they both have immediacy aspects to them that's parallel. The key difference is there's not a lot of epistemic uncertainty anymore around climate change. I mean, there is maybe the longer the timeline goes out or the specifics, but the fact that anthropogenic climate change is a thing, like almost universally shared among the science community. This is not something we're debating any longer. And yet COVID is so new and things are moving so quickly, again, that coupling of speed and novelty, but there's a lot of epistemic uncertainty. So we're learning things and guidelines are shifting as we learn new things, and we being the scientific community largely. And then the public, that being better or worse communicated to the public. So that level of uncertainty, I think, is another aspect to think about when we're trying to make these comparisons. And again, I don't know what to do with that necessarily, except to say it's really important to point out where analogies can be made and where they're weak.
Yeah, those are good examples. I actually quite like the climate change analogy. I think in many ways it is comparable, and there is still uncertainty for many people about the implications of climate change. While the scientific community may be agreed upon it, you know, the lay public are not convinced. The lay public don't necessarily feel the immediacy. I mean, honestly, I think what are we at? Like a couple of degrees average increase? You know, do you necessarily feel that if you got your AC running? I mean, we'll go outside and say, oh, it's hot today, it's cold today, oh, it's global warming, oh, no, it's not. It's really hard for people to say they understand the immediacy when the immediacy is in the minds of the statisticians and the climatologists who understand the general trends, whereas the individual feels the ebbs and flows of temperature, you know, and may not necessarily want to believe that, oh yeah, I can definitely feel the effects of that 2 degree C increase or whatever, you know, whatever we're at now. So I don't know if I agree that people understand the immediacy. They do if they're climatologists or if they're plugged into science and believe that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, that's a really, I mean, I think there's so many great analogies even in that example. So we could identify specific communities, island nations, for instance, who are feeling the effects of climate change right now. And so it is immediate.
Or Miami.
Okay, yeah, there you go. You don't have to go to the islands. Yeah, sure, Miami. So there are some people in some places who are directly proximate and they're thinking about those effects right now. Similarly, I could just give you a personal example. My 83-year-old grandmother is very concerned about COVID, and yet is surrounded by people who are not at risk statistically, by medical preconditions, I guess, not at risk. And so she's having a really hard time. Like a lot of her neighbors and friends are just going about their business, and she's debating whether or not she should, given what she knows about the science and about her community. So I think there's some analogies. There are some communities of people at risk for whom COVID is much closer. Or maybe if you're not at risk, but you know somebody who's contracted the virus and had really severe symptoms or even passed away, like then it's much more proximate to you. So I guess, again, that sort of the ethics sensitivity component, the closer an issue is to you in a personal sort of a motive or affective way, the more salient that ethics issue is. And so, right, for me, who was trained as a sort of environment, animals ethicist guy, I'm in a place of privilege, so I'm not living on an island or in Miami. Nothing's getting flooded. I have air conditioning, all those things, and yet I have a different perspective of this. So that issue is more sensitive to me than others. But I think that the idea of the lay public is also something that bothers me, and I want to maybe turn there next. But before I do, I want to read Renee's comment because I don't think it's going to be saved in our recording. So Renee, who's online, wrote, trying to share briefly the most salient points from my contribution. While not COVID related as such, my recent experience with similar egg sorting ethics we're seeing in public health responses to pandemic versus extant or ongoing public health realities. Financial tools for safety net recipients aren't widely available because they're hard to make. especially for disability-related benefits. Recently, a developer asked me, Renee, to write up the rules they need to consider to add a disability program to their system. When the developer saw how many changes would be necessary for even a minimum level of integration, they balked and asked for even more minimal approach. And this happens all the time. Renee says less needy people have an opportunity to consistently generate for them by different iterations of philanthropy or policy, because it's easier to meet the needs of less needy people. Now, this developer stands to indirectly reinforce the very problem they've sought to alleviate. And I think that's a really important point too. There's and I'm not doing a very good job of mapping these all conceptually in my head in a way that is consistent, but I think what Renee is after is something about the energy, for lack of a better term, needed to intervene. So there's some instances where we can just say, let's pass a universal standardized COVID relief policy. Everybody gets $600 a month. But then there's all sorts of pushback and nuance, and the more of that nuance you pick up, the more energy that issue it takes to address that issue and that nuance. And I think that's paralleling exactly what Renee is talking about. The more complex an issue is, the more energy it takes to resolve in a thoughtful way, and therefore less likely we are to put in that energy. And this is a problem in, if you think about this, the model of ethics literacy that I continue to lean on. We talked a little bit about the ethics sensitivity part. The reasoning is where I was focused, but Renee is now talking about motivation, like how do we act on what we think is the right thing to do? And part of that is just like how much energy does it take to actually move our thinking into action? And again, that's a fundamentally important point, because no matter how important an issue is to you, no matter how carefully you reason about it, if nothing changes, if there's no practical output, then you're stuck in the theory, and that's no good for anybody. Renee said, thanks for synthesizing. So I think I did a reasonably good job of covering her point. So there's a lot of things we're sort of circling around, and I don't know how to bring them together in any coherent way. Any thoughts on where to go next?
So the great philosopher Sacha Baron Cohen was recently posting as himself, not as Borat, that part of what has happened in this landscape is so much has broken down in the experience of shared truth. And that is the basis. He was speaking specifically about democracy, and that is what's a root cause of some of that there are multiple kind of political realities that people are living in right now that do not match. And I would extend that argument to the COVID landscape, that we do not have a shared truth of the reality of the disease, of the threat of the disease, of the experience of the disease. And so there is no, by extension, there is no public health, because we have tiny little publics instead of the health of the, whatever area, the state, the county, whatever landscape you want to choose. We talk about public health in our own household, like that our household has its own public health. Like if someone gets the flu, the public health risk in our home has, gone up and our immunity has gone down. And we've said that for years because we count on each other, moving in the world, having different effects, and we have teenagers and elderly people. So I'm like Piaget, who does research on his own children. Like I have my own little lab right here. And that prefrontal cortex thing is huge. Those are the 17-year-old and the 71-year-old are the only people pushing on the rules in our own home, like with direct results of health and unhealth, and I think what's happened with COVID is people's intersectionalities and their positionalities have become more relevant and more to the surface. And so those places where we could kind of moderate our experiences in the world, whether it was age and access or ability or disability or whatever margins the different people have had experiences with, that COVID has like sharpened them and complicated them and multiplied them. And then without having that shared truth foundation, when we know, I mean, the 7 little boxes right here, we know that the virus is a outsized actor, like agent in all of this, right? But without the public's buy-in, they're saying that there isn't. It's not, it's a tiny little thing in their world. And, you know, and so we run into kind of how our current president mobilized that base that had never been addressed, those people that wanted, you know, no career politicians, somebody to speak kind of boisterously, right? Like not in the accepted discourse for political engagement. That base was always there, but they were never fully activated and mobilized. And his rhetoric, I mean, that's like a success model, right? I mean, like an anti-success model, but it happened. So I think we can learn from that somehow. I don't think it's happening too quickly for us to have all the strategies pulled out of it in like a prescriptive list. But somehow it would be really great if we did, because then we could activate that group that thinks they have never been addressed, that they have, even though like they're usually white and privileged, but they feel like they're on the margins and they behave that way and they're enjoying being centered right now. You know, how do we get them to use that energy and power? And of course, mathematically, like all of the minoritized groups collectively form a majority. So if there was a public shared truth there, the public health benefits would be, they'd start to add up anyway, you know? So that was like a lot.
No, that's
If
really
I can
good.
find that Sacha Baron Cohen link, I'll put it up, because it was actually really well explained idea.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm really impressed with the thoughtfulness of comics generally, Cohen especially. Yeah, that's a really important point. I think about this on and off regularly, like the extent to which we ought to be after a shared truth. The last time I can, again, not that I lived it, but the last time historically I could think about a shared moment of truth was sort of, I mean, to the extent that it was during World War II, where the country together had a shared enemy and came together to do things that came together. I guess we'll just leave it at that. Even if you think about other moments that historically we're taught are moments of shared truth, like the social justice movement, those are contentious moments, leading to death and destruction and violence, upheaval, radical change. Like the idea that a shared truth is something attainable given what? The diversity of our demographics, the sheer scale of our geography, the differences in our cultures, our languages. Yeah, maybe that's right. Maybe if what you're saying, Nikki, is maybe there was never a shared truth. Yeah, maybe that's it. Now, I think the idea of shared truth is a really powerful one, because if we just stick in the COVID epidemic and public health responses, there have been other nations, and again, these are geographically smaller, less diverse nations, that had really strong, in terms of their public health outcomes, responses to the virus. But again, that's at an expense of, let's call it, diversity writ large. Right? And so again, there's a trade-off, perhaps not a value trade-off in the sense that I define it, but the idea that like we're trading off a diversity of voices against, in this case, public health outcomes. if what public health outcomes required are a shared truth. And again, I'm totally just spitballing here because I haven't thought any of this through in any careful way. But I'm putting together a list now of things we've talked about. So we've talked about time and the immediacy of impact. We've talked about personal sacrifice and access. We've talked about epistemic uncertainty and shared truth. We've talked about even things as subtle as the neurology of decision making. And we talked about the Nikki, your 17 and 71-year-olds in the sort of prefrontal cortex. And Dr. Beever mentioned this too. We talked about issues of motivation that come and go. And these are all things at play in this initial debate that I set up for us between bioethics and public health ethics. So let me circle back for a second. And I don't want to derail us. So, oh, yeah, and Sterling, okay, good. Before I circle back, Sterling, I just saw posted another instance of coming together, and that might have been September 11th, 2001, which we just found 9/11. That might have been a moment where at least enough people came together around a shared truth to have a pretty substantial impact. And it's such a strange moment to me, yeah, at least for a couple of days. It's such a strange moment to me because even in that moment, almost immediately, you had communities of people who said things like, it was a hoax, it was staged, it was done by the administration, it was blah, blah, blah. On the other side, you've got people who have internalized that moment. Again, really important, I don't want to downplay this, but it's not as though more people died in that moment than have ever died in any other event, even here in the US before, right? So it was a really, I wrote about this shortly after 2001, but it was a really powerful symbolic moment for the nation. And I think that the role of symbols, the things people want to stand for and stand on and stand against, that's what draws people together. And those symbols shape what our shared truth is like. So yeah, that's another really important example story. Thanks. So let me circle back around for a minute. I mentioned to you, I started by talking through the bioethical principles, and I mentioned 3 of them. So we mentioned respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, and beneficence, and I said, I think those are in tension with public health approaches. There's a 4th principle though, right? And that's the principle of justice. Now, the principle of justice is essential. It's one of the 4 key principles in bioethics. And that principle on face seems to align really well with public health concerns. And again, that's so to just make it explicit. That's where I was thinking about this topic today, is that when we're thinking about COVID and social justice, justice concerns are where bioethics and public health ethics intersect. Both they come together there, and also they're in points of tension. Yeah, great. Yes, Nikki's point is really good. So Nikki wrote, I think as a country, it was a shared pain, 9/11. So it might not have been a shared foundation regarding priorities, but everybody felt the pain.
I think that's the difference now, or one of them, is that we are not in a moment of shared pain.
And again, that might be the immediacy question that Dr. Kugler brought up, right? It's in a moment we lost 3,000 lives, and we've lost orders of magnitude more than that in the country from COVID, but not with the immediacy, and not with the symbolic referent or the visual aspect, which I think are both fundamental.
There was an immediacy in March and April.
Yeah, so maybe that's right. Or maybe like people were worried there and we had better adherence to mandates and things.
Everybody had it, went inside immediately. Yeah, it was
fair. Yeah. Well, again, if we think that immediacy is the sort of linchpin here, it'll be interesting to see what happens as things seem to be ramping back up across the country.
That's not my recollection of the events. My recollection of the events in March is people debated about what to do for quite some time. People argued whether it could be addressed with testing or not. People argued about whether we should go inside or not, or who should go inside. And then slowly and extremely reluctantly, states started imposing go inside orders. It was certainly not immediate, and many states were slow to rise to it and were stragglers and were only implemented partial go inside orders, and were also very reluctant even to require mask mandates. That stretched on for several weeks, as I recall. So in retrospect, it feels like it was immediate, but I think it's because of just the time that has evolved. I think we were actually quite slow to respond. There was a huge spectrum of response, and there was tremendous reluctance and debate. And then as soon as we kind of went inside or started wearing masks, within weeks, people were already talking about phase 2 and phase 3 reopening, and that might be in 2 or 3 weeks without any kind of basis in fact or data. You know, in Florida, it was mostly based on the summer's approaching, it's the tourism season, we really need to reopen. So it was driven by economic needs to talk about reopening and changing or not shutting down as quickly as we might have or should have. It didn't even have to, I think, necessarily be about shutting down. I think if we'd have worn masks, we'd have been fine and wouldn't have had to shut down as much as we did.
I mean, I think that speaks to what you were talking about with liberty, and that like it's a uniquely United States value, that individualism, you know, and the countries that had more collective cultures like Japan, where like if you had a cold, you're used to wearing a mask. Like that's not a new practice at all. And people actually had their own masks already because that's part of, like, you have Band-Aids in your house.
I think that's true. That's my perception. I lived in Japan for a little while, and I've lived in Germany for a year and lived in England for about 6 or 7. Certainly the cultures are very different, right? We know that wearing a mask has no stigma associated with it in Asia. In fact, in Asia, if you go out and you cough and have a cold, you will evoke stigma. People will look at you and you know, as a pariah. So there's an expectation in Asia that people are going to work together and cooperate. You know, there's much more cultural homogeneity. England, and I think the US even more, stand out as places where individual liberties are more important. I think the US experience, though, to some extent is amplified on top of that for a number of reasons. It became political quickly. You know, there's that whole dimension. And there's the issue of immediacy, which everyone could feel, but Asia had several years prior experiences with swine flu and H1N1 and so on. And so the notion of an epidemic or pandemic was much better understood for them than maybe it was in the West. So there's all that historical context and also cultural context. But I would argue that I think a big explainer maybe of extreme pushback against COVID in the US has partly to do with just people's limited bandwidth to cope with problems. There's a Maslow hierarchy of needs at play. And in the US, one of those big hierarchies is I gotta have a job, I gotta work. And COVID impacted the service sector tremendously. We're largely a service sector economy in the US. So much manufacturing has been lost. I think, and about 70% of our economy is based on retail and service sector commerce. And so when you say go inside and quit going to restaurants, that impacts a lot of people. And if you don't have the immediacy of I'm dying or grandma's dying from COVID, but you say we're going to have to shut down restaurants, so you're going to lose your job, that suddenly becomes a problem for people because of their hierarchy of needs. We're extremely vulnerable economically in the US by nature of low living wage, you know, high costs of medical care, all of the things that make living in the US very complicated. So people feel day to day vulnerable. Almost nobody saves money in the US. Many people don't have checking accounts because they don't have enough money to actually open one up. And so they live from check to check. And so then you suddenly tell people, put on a mask, this is the most important thing in your life. That dog doesn't hunt for a lot of people. And then you say, oh, and we're gonna have to shut down the economy, you may lose your job. That's even worse. So I think the US experience is in some way unique. And I think it's largely, a lot of it, the differences are explained in terms of individualism. But I think just the economic vulnerability of people in the US amplified the anti-COVID public health response. That's based on no data, by the way.
Marissa mentioned also that the Florida economy, our economy, is so service bound that it faces that threat in an important way too. There's a good transition point there, Steve, because I keep reading all these, there's all this literature around X as a public health issue. And there's a good argument to be made, I think, that economic disparity is a public health issue, right? For exactly the reasons you were saying. So public health has this incredibly broad mandate compared to bioethics, where bioethics is about, now it's split, now it's becoming about physical and informational health, basically. Like, how is my data being protected? How's my physical body being protected, etc. But bioethics is focused on the individual because, and started so early in the US in the 1940s because of individual concerns. But public health ethics had a much later start because we don't do a very good job here because of our focus on the individual of thinking about social justice issues. So that's something else to consider. Like if that's our turning point, if that's how we see a difference between bioethics and public health ethics, what's the mandate of public health ethics? It seems to be any inequity that has potential health impacts is an issue of public health. And that's huge because that is everything. I mean, the argument you made, I think, was really powerful. That if you don't have enough money to even open a checking account, you're not going to prioritize your health and other people's health by staying home and wearing a mask. Like, you're going to go to work.
I wanted to add that also, I think on top of what Steve was saying, it's not just work, no work. It's limits your choices in as to how you shop, where you go, how because some of us have the options of telecommuting and living, saying you should wear a mask versus other folks who don't have those options that can't get 101 deliveries a day to supplement their hunker down quarantineism. And, I think that's part of that economic argument.
Yeah,
people, especially in Florida. And I totally get the reasoning for wanting to open up the state, but at the same point, it is very dangerous. It's tough. People have to eat.
Renee just posted that there's also inequity, social justice, and public health issues around healthcare and coverage, like accessibility. Even here in Florida, we've got such a broad spectrum of options and limitations for people that it's got what she says is generational and behavioral health outcomes. So emotional dysregulation, executive dysfunction, she says, all play into the pandemic reaction. And I think that's right. I mean, again, all of this. So the basic premise, I guess, that I'm offering now is that the thing that identifies public health is specifically its social justice response. So anytime we're thinking about concerns, how our actions or lack of action affect other people, that's a public health issue, not a bioethics issue. So even while, so then let me circle back around and ask you, justice plays this really big role in bioethics. So what does the justice principle do in bioethics, if not a public health?
Say that again, please.
So bioethics has a principle of justice embedded in it as a core principle. And I guess I'm wondering, like, what role does that principle do if it's not a social justice role? Like, if it's not a public health role, if it's specifically in the bioethics context, what's the difference between bioethical justice and public health? And I don't have any answers. This is something that interests me, which is why I'm bringing it to you all.
Well, I think you made, of course, a really good point by talking about how those principles originated, and that it was from an individualistic, perspective. So I think like applying justice principles to one person or a very small group of people, especially in terms of care, even continuity of care, you're going to find there's always tension between, small and large proportions, right? Although those ratios. I mean, there's a mommy blogger who talks about, she says there's no such thing as other people's children. Like all children are our responsibility. You can't say, well, those children are in danger, but my children are fine. So I don't have any responsibility to do anything. And her point is all the children are all of our responsibility. And when she writes about that, it seems very clear and it resonates with a wide audience. And they're like, oh yeah, of course, other children are my responsibility. Of course, I don't want sick and starving and hurting children in the world. But like, does that expire when they're 12 or 15 or 19? Like, we're all each other's. So I think when you're talking in terms of justice and resources and valuing complexity, I think it's like Sisyphus, where every day we start back again carrying the same load up the mountain, and we're fighting the exact same arguments and the exact same like infrastructure deficits. I mean, a lot of people receive those services, those healthcare services, through the school system. So when the schools were closed, which was supposed to be in support of public health, I'm not arguing that it wasn't, but I'm saying the reality of it is that many children no longer received their healthcare services. So, and of course, as the time increased, the pain points also increased. And I think just as a nation, the order of events is really important in the United States. If we had COVID with a different president and then Trump became president, or having Trump as the president and then COVID comes. And so I think we were already in a, playing with matches arena that people were willing to question what seems like basic, obvious scientific advice. And then applying that justice without just saying, I have mine, I'm safe, I'm fine. So doing it without concern for a population, and pick a population, it doesn't matter, without a population,
Yeah, that makes sense. Like as you're talking, I'm seeing I feel like what you're saying is there's sort of a radical push to uphold the respect for autonomy principle at the expense of a justice principle. That we're not thinking about justice, maybe because, in part at least, because of mistrust of science and difference of opinion and like sources of information and all the things that the sort of clusterfuck of experiences that we've had in the country right now, that the conditions we live under right now have allowed us to prioritize this one principle, even implicitly, at the expense of all the other approaches, which is precisely what bioethics is. Principles, or at least mandates that we not do. Yeah, maybe that's right. Yeah, sure. So survival, or at least survival of perspective, beats justice. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. When I was thinking about this distinction that I'm trying to get at around like what justice does in bioethics vis-a-vis public health ethics, I was thinking about vaccines. The best example I can come up with is vaccines. In the bioethics literature right now, conversations in bioethics, there's a lot being said about vaccine development and testing and application. And justice plays a really important role here in bioethics, precisely because we don't want to be caught in a position where we're unfairly or unjustly targeting vaccine trials or treatments, cutting some types of people out. You be more careful. Some types of individuals out rather than other individuals. And again, the bioethics around vaccine development are focused on how does the thing I'm doing affect the individual's health. Right? And again, we don't want to. There was a big push to make sure we incorporated African American populations in vaccine trials, which we failed to do in the past. Development in trials, because we want to make sure that when a vaccine comes on the market, it's applicable to a wide cross section of the genetic and racial and gender and like all the forms of diversity we have going on. When public health ethicists think about the vaccine debate, the issues they focus on are not the same set of issues. I think when public health ethicists focus on the vaccine debate, they're focusing on take-up issues. Right? So how do we convince people not to, convince is not the right word, perhaps it is. How do we help overcome epistemic obstacles to people taking up vaccines? Like, so public health ethicists in the literature are focused on vaccine denialism, right? Anti-vax campaigns, these sorts of things. Public health campaigns, advertising, getting the word out, correcting misunderstandings about vaccines. What they're not focused on is individuals. They focus on the community. And I think, again, I'm say it again and again, I'm kind of spitballing here, but I think there's tension. Because on the one hand, we want to make sure we're not thinking at the community level as bioethicists. Because when we do that, we tend to leave some people out. There seem to be justice concerns inherent in thinking at the collective level. And yet the public health ethicist says, no, yeah, but you have to. So you have to at once, around the justice principle, think both in terms of the individual and the collective. There's a whole bunch more to say. I want to, and I don't know how to do this here. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share my screen here just for a brief second to share with you, and I'll post this link in the chat, at least. The American Public Health Association has a Principles of Public Health thing they put out in 2002, which a bunch of us have been involved in thinking about updating, et cetera, et cetera. But there's some core principles here, some core values and beliefs. So they're talking in terms of humanity has a right to resources necessary for health. This second one is really important for our discussion. Humans are not individuals, but inherently interdependent. And then this third value is about trust, right? The effectiveness of public health institutions depends on the public's trust, depends on collaboration, that people and their physical environments are interdependent, and that every person's views matter when it comes to public health decisions. And again, what we're talking here is collectivism, right? We're talking about approaches to public health where the priority is on the collective group. So this might be a fun thing to think through. They list a series of 12 principles of public health that you could compare then to our takes on bioethics a little later on. I'm also going to post for you a piece by Nancy Cass, who's a bioethicist who wrote back in 2001 a framework for public health ethics, where what she's talking about in this piece is not principles or normative guidance, but about the relationship between bioethics and public health, and a series of 6 steps for consideration when you're thinking about a public health framework. So for those of you interested in thinking about this a little further, the third thing I'll share in the chat and with anybody else who reaches out to me is an interview I did with Nancy Cass a few years ago here at UCF for one of my classes. She came to campus and gave a talk about public health ethics. So just to give a little more context to our discussion here, you'll see these 3 bits of things in the chat. And I think part of the reason for this is I felt a little guilty for not giving you a slide deck or something at the front end. But I'm really grateful for our discussion. This is, I learn a lot every time I get the chance to talk things through, and that's kind of the point of this discussion. None of us in this and anything we're talking about are have boundless knowledge. So there's always more stuff to learn. Other final thoughts? We've got about 4 minutes left. I want to make sure I keep us on track. I'm going to go ahead and post those links. Anybody who's watching this video later, you can reach out to me. So there's the interview with Nancy.
I guess one question I would ask is, could we come away from this with a thought as to whether or not there is a clear revelational distinction about COVID as a public health issue with ethical questions that is distinct from any other public health crisis in the past? So we talked a lot about the nuance of the situation, cultural issues, political dimensions and response and all that. But all of that aside, is there anything that's clear about COVID as an experience that revealed any new ethical conundrums that were not known otherwise? Do you understand what I'm asking? Or
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And,
I mean, like when we invent CRISPR, suddenly ethical conundrums become so much more significant, right? About gene editing. We could hypothesize and read science fiction about gene editing and say, oh, wow, that's going to really make a challenge. Once it becomes a reality, now there's real ethical issues that people start to think about connected with CRISPR. It suddenly becomes real, right? Issues of access, issues of disease prevention, issues of genetic selection, all these things. So is there any inherent new reality with COVID that makes us understand new ethical questions that we didn't otherwise have to wrestle with?
yeah, my instinct is to say, and this is partly selfish because it's what I've been focused on recently, but the thing that stands out to me as really novel about COVID is that it's put into stark relief how interdependent we are. Right? That we're contingent on our network of social relations, on our environments, on our things as small as our commutes, like our daily schedules. And when those things get thrown off because of, say, a pandemic, there are significant health implications. There'll be a whole generation of kids, for instance, who will have had very different experiences of a year of their formative year of their life than any other generation ever has. And what the long-term, say, psychological or affective issues will be with those kids is something on my mind for sure. But that's also true of all the rest of us who have now spent whatever we're after, 7, 8, 9 months socially isolated or socially distanced. Like, will there be a moment where we'll just go back to the way things were? I mean, my instinct is that I'm going to be wearing a mask a lot more, even if tomorrow, like, COVID goes away. Now we're in flu season, like, a mask makes sense to me. So I think there's things about the ways I interact with people that have fundamentally changed. Now, I don't know if that's the kind of novelty you were thinking about, Dr. Kruger, but it's been really important to me. Like, my lived experience feels different. So my relationship to health is different.
Talking like greater societal changes, perhaps, that have become more common. What you're talking about, I could see that because of what the predictions are, is it becomes a more seasonal thing, like cold or flu season. That we have this novel virus floating around, we're going to have a different life that we've enjoyed previous to now. So
Yeah,
I was thinking.
go ahead. No, Gets.
Go ahead.
No,
Okay,
you.
one quick thing was that I was hoping that Jonathan could tell me if there was like I'm thinking we're gone when things are tough, like during this pandemic, like Steve was saying, you know, monetary issues or problem economics. Do we go back? Is there like the pyramid of needs? Is there a pyramid of ethics that we can look at that say like, oh, when this goes this way, we're back to lifeboat ethics here, or we're back, like the ethical is there an ethical pyramid we can just start trying to see?
Yeah. So the short answer is no, right? Normative theory doesn't work like that. It doesn't scaffold, like we don't all start off as utilitarians and then become virtue ethicists as we age or something. Normative theories are tools we can apply. Again, I'm offering here what we call a pluralistic understanding of ethics, but yeah, the idea is normative theories are tools we can apply to understand value differences. If you're a strict like moral development sort of person like Lawrence Kohlberg, there might be a slightly different story we could tell. But my instinct, Marissa, is instead to say, don't think about it in terms of ethics, but think about upon which ethics relies. So if you think, I often tell my undergraduates in philosophy about like a pyramid model you were saying of philosophy, where at the bottom is logic and worldview, like ontology stuff, and then knowledge claims, epistemology. And on top of that, you've got politics, ethics, and aesthetics. And anytime any of those foundations shift, ethical analysis changes, right? So a thing you thought you had all figured out because of everything that it relied on changes, you got to refigure it. And what I tell my undergraduates is, as much as you want to think you've got that pyramid secure, it's constantly changing. So ethical evaluation changes all the time. And so the toolbox approach, where you're using different normative theories to unpack an issue, like the ones we talked about today, like that's an ongoing project. It's a project of ethics literacy. So that's my take, at least a little bit.
Yeah, that was really interesting, Jonathan. And that's kind of where I was going with, has COVID taught us anything new? I'd like to think that had we not the internet, our response to COVID would have been very different. There would have not been remote schooling, for example. It was comparatively easy in many ways, especially in urban communities, to say, okay, well, everyone head home, will do homeschooling, right? And then one of the reactions has been, gee, it turns out it didn't work as well as we thought. This internet thing is pretty powerful if I want to go home shopping, but it's not very effective necessarily for maintaining community. And to Sterling's point in the chat, he said, it was very disruptive for communities of faith, where that was an important part of their social and mental well-being. And because of COVID, that got shut down. So there was a public health imperative, right? And so we went home, but we hurt people who had mental health issues, who were sequestered and needed social interaction. We hurt people who rely upon faith communities. We maybe over-relied upon the efficacy of the internet as a way to continue schooling and other things, but without really understanding how humans work and the impact that would have on humans. So that was the kind of thing that I was after. And I think you hit upon it when you talked about how when our foundations shift, we have to totally rethink ethics. In some ways, I think maybe COVID was a foundational shift just because of the times that we're in. We over-relied on the internet as a panacea for the situation. And that's part of our gnashing of teeth that we're doing now as we think about, what does phase 3 look like? And are we willing to maybe go out more because, well, we can't rely upon homeschooling as much as we thought, and so on, and other realities I'm glossing over a lot.
Yeah, that might be a really good place to end, because what you're talking about is, or what I see you talking about is information access as a public health issue too.
Partly, yeah.
There's something to be said for the idea that we can rely on information flows to inform us and ultimately keep us healthy. But if we don't all have equal access to equal information, then there's health disparity, making it then a public health issue. Oh, thanks. So, Nikki, you mentioned Jurgensen's concept of digital dualism as a framework we might take on. So we could share resources there too if you've got some for us. As always, everybody, thank you so much for spending an hour with us. This is super fun, for me at least, every 2 weeks. I'm really grateful to you all.